Hi, welcome to another episode of Swarajya Conversations. Today we have with us Dr. Shamika Ravi. She is Director, Brookings India and former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Thank you so much for your time, ma'am.
My pleasure.
So starting with the slowdown, the general slowdown, people have their own definitions of slowdown. For some it's extreme, for some it's there but not that impactful. Where do you see the slowdown in India as?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that there is a slowdown. And there are two aspects of it. One is the fact that we have slipped below the immediate long term of 7%. That we generally tend to believe as a cyclical component of it. Meaning, look, globally things are changing, things are becoming uncertain. Some of it has to do with just the uncertainty environment. The banking, the enforcement of some of the recent reform measures have added to it. And which is okay. Cyclical aspects can be countered through monetary policy. Important to realize though is that even 7% was not the aspiration a year back. We were talking about how do we attain double digit.
Right.
And from that perspective, the slowdown seems even more of a concern because now we need to fundamentally talk about the structural reforms that we have stopped talking about. The economy has to go back to a long-term sustained growth of 8+. The kind of exponential growth we saw after the Vajpayee era, we have to think of the kind of reforms required to take us back on that path. And those are the structural reforms. And in that vein, I think a lot needs to be done. I think the FM is managing the cyclical aspect of it in terms of the recent, for instance, the announcements, slew of announcements that we have had. The corporate tax reduction, I think, has a much more longer term impact in terms of making India more competitive along with the emerging markets because business is mobile in the current environment, despite anti-globalization movements about. But I think we have to go back to structural reforms.
Right. So talking of reforms, you've been very vocal that we need both macro and micro reforms, saying that choosing between one is like choosing between air and water.
Yes.
Right. So how do you see the government attaining this balance between macro and micro reforms? Because if macro reforms are healthy for the economy, you need micro reforms for the people, for the local communities. Right. So how do you see government attaining that balance?
So Tushar, it's important to understand that when we talk of micro reforms, microeconomic reforms have to do with households, have to do with industries, specific industries. Macro, of course, when you talk of the larger macro policies, like the monetary policies, reduction in cost of capital, you talk of large fiscal policies, large NREGA type, PMJY type of. Now, these kind of fiscal and monetary policies are more macro in nature. What is micro, and I think the Modi government in the first 5 years has been very good at doing them, is in the form of the Swarajya Bharat Abhiyan, has been in the form of the crop insurance, even the health insurance which has been, the LPG scheme, the housing scheme. Now these are schemes which are sector specific, industry specific, which have had obviously, impact in terms of the political outcomes.
Right.
But, aspects of hygiene, healthcare, like Swarajya Bharat when we talk about LPG indoor pollution, in terms of the health insurance, in terms of generally out-of-pocket burden, etc. Now we talk about the piped water. These kind of, they are micro in their nature, but they have long-term productivity gains, enhancements for the economy as a whole. People just become more productive when they are healthier and they get access to water and so on and so forth. So you have to do both. One is not a substitute to the other. I think smart economies in the recent past have done a combination of both.
Right. So, in terms, you spoke at length about the micro reforms, the Jan Dhan, the Ayushman Bharat and the Swachh Bharat. Now, where do you see the next reforms coming from? Like the government has stressed time again, they want to double farmers' income. Right. So, is agriculture the next area of growth, or should we be looking at manufacturing or industry?
I think first of all, it's important to acknowledge and accept the reality that agriculture cannot be an engine of growth for the Indian economy. Our growth engines will have to be manufacturing from an employment perspective, and services has been the growth engine for the last 20 years or so.
20 years, yes.
Now, moving ahead, I think, frankly, we have to bet on our healthcare sector, because Indian healthcare sector has the potential to be what the IT sector was for the last 25 years, I think healthcare sector can be that for the next 25 years. But obviously, it will require, again, going back to the structural reforms. And by structural reforms, Tushar, it means very specific things. For instance, if it takes you 15 years to clear a land case on an average in Bihar, who will invest in Bihar? Right? So, the administration of the judiciary is a very fundamental aspect of judicial reform. The fact that land reform, though we tabled it and went back, it is high time we went back to again land, being able to have land transactions is a very fundamental aspect of any growing economy. The labor laws. Some states did experiment and they, in fact, successfully, but most states have not touched labor laws at all. Agriculture remains one of our missed opportunities. I think in the last 30 years, agriculture we have been paying lip service. And quite understandably, because the political economy is such that despite high growth over the last 30 years, 45% of the population is still in agriculture. Right? So they might not be doing cultivation, but they are related activities, etc. Now it's important to realize that while in every emerging market, every growth economies, they go through this transition from agriculture to manufacturing to services. In India, this base still remains very large. Agriculture has limitations to productivity growth. So no country other than barring Switzerland perhaps has, which is a high-tech agricultural market, one can think of it like that. Given the limitations of productivity, we have to think of manufacturing and services. So there has to be a concerted effort to bring about agricultural reform so that we are not artificially pushing people back into agriculture when the aspirations are to grow with the rest of the world.
A short note on agricultural reforms. We are 45% of the population still somehow directly or indirectly working in agriculture.
Right.
At this point, how do you see the waivers? Because the Modi government in 2014, they promised that they will do away with such a policy. But again, the political economy, the political intricacies are such that they cannot do away with the waivers. So do you see waivers as the future of agricultural reforms? No? Yes?
Tushar, I'll tell you, I think Mr. Modi and his team, people trust this team, right? Fundamentally, given the mandate that they have come back with.
Yes.
And after 370, after the kind of policies that they have shown the mettle to bring about, agriculture reform is nothing. Saying that, look, people are intelligent, by the way, and they do, I mean, the strong leaders do take people along when they make tough decisions. And I think people will still support. It's like the demonetization decision. Despite the pains, people went along because fundamentally they believe the intent. And that's very important. So agriculture waivers, say, getting rid of those waivers, of course, we have to bring the discipline back into the credit markets. Today, when people take loans, at least in the agriculture sector, the expectation is that it will be waived off.
Yes.
In fact, the only person who looks really silly is the farmer who has worked hard and repaid the loans. Because clearly, every state has shown that you can galvanize the population in agriculture and demand waivers, and political class has been quite willing to give those waivers. But eventually, it's not free. There is no free lunch. Somebody is paying for it, which means the government, the banks. And public sector banks paying for it means the government, which means people are paying for it. Now, how much of it can you afford? Right? One is just the monetary cost. But what about the discipline? Credit discipline takes generations to bring about. Right? Credit is not a freebie. So the minute you give a loan, the expectation is that you work hard and you repay the loan. So the future contract that you're writing between two parties, that credit discipline comes about over generations of such transactions. So I think this political interference in the credit markets, I think, must be minimized. And when there is necessity, and there is necessity because we are reliant on monsoons, we do have large-scale aggregate shocks, right? And in those situations, I think it is justified. And the government has the means to. But it should not become an electoral
policy.
Yes.
Right. You just spoke about how it takes for some cases to take 15 years to be cleared, like the land reform on Bihar, and that kills investments. So how do you see the economic repercussions of judicial delays and decisions? Like we just saw in the telecom industry last week, then the coal allocations. So how do you see all of this as as a discouraging aspect for investments in India?
Very immediately, contract enforcement is very much a part of ease of doing business. If I'm not sure that I can actually liquidate or I can take my profits, or at least liquidate my investments if I need to, or sell my business to whoever, I'm not going to invest, right? Business is essentially, business decisions are made on a certain trust in the market. That trust happens also from the fact that contracts will be enforced, that you do have mechanisms within the judiciary where things will happen, and by the way, not just after 20 or 30 years, but it will happen immediately, because there is opportunity cost of capital lying trapped inside a bad investment, right? That was the whole reason for the IBC. But IBC is about a small part of the market. There's a very large market out there, and this is where now you have to talk about every district court. If there is a litigation on a certain land, it needs to be cleared, right? If there is some transaction, some labor transaction, and you have gone to the courts, it must be cleared. Because unless these cases move in a timely fashion, business decisions are going to be delayed very strongly, right? Now, that is one aspect of it, where we are monetizing delays and uncertainty from the judiciary, and that's a heavy cost. But the other aspect has to do with the fact that there are economic implications of judgments as well. For instance, in 2014, when the Supreme Court basically annulled the coal allocations of the past 18 years based on a PIL by Mr. Prashant Bhushan, I think we have paid the price in terms of lower growth. Our economic growth has been impacted because fundamentally that judgment gave the world a view that, look, in India, contract enforcement is not very robust, in the sense it can go against individual contracts, right? Because when the allocation started from 92, 93 onwards, and of course under Vajpayee you've had tremendous power sector reforms, you see entire economy grows around those decisions of the government to allocate, right? Millions of people get employed. The bank sector exposure to the power sector in early 2000 was about 0.4%. And by 2012-13, by the time this PIL happened, it had risen to about 22%. So the decision to annul these allocations, while it must have been right, this is the Supreme Court, so it probably was right. But there are economic costs to it. So the point is, we need to now consider case by case. We need to understand that contract enforcement is important and there are economic costs to it. And that knowledge itself and that improved understanding within the judiciary, I think, can go a long way in making India a business-friendly country.
Talking of economic costs, one debate is around disinvestment, especially in terms of Air India. People had this opinion that instead of letting Jet Airways fail, the Air India could have been, disinvested and the money could have been spun around and Jet Airways could have been helped. The same for the telecom sector. BSNL does not have a lot of takers today as it once had, because Jio has disrupted the industry. Jio has taken over rural India with 340 million new subscribers alone. Right. So where do you see this disinvestment debate going? Is it okay for the government to continue with their pursuit of disinvesting from Air India or from BSNL? How do you see this?
Look, the government should get out of this. It's very simple. Because, first of all, I think the markets in India have opened exactly in these sectors. Hospitality, why do we have government hotels, ITDC? The aviation sector has done rather well in India. In fact, there were times when we were the only growing economy in terms of aviation. Globally, aviation sector was doing badly. And that's because that's the nature of this growing, robust, large, dynamic, right, economy. Now, in a situation like this, for the government to be an active player / regulator does disrupt the market to some extent. Now, the logic we've been hearing constantly is that we need to get the price right, because the markets are not looking good, so we might not get the right price. The right way to look at this is the opportunity cost of maintaining these bad assets and running them within the government. So overall then, therefore, it's a much more costlier venture than the cash transaction that you have at a point in time. So the revenue foregone, or the cost, the opportunity cost of maintaining some of these public sector units is very high. Now, beyond that, there is also the symbolism of what does it denote to private enterprise? What is the symbol we are giving, signal? Under Vajpayee regime, we had a cabinet ranked ministry for disinvestment. That gave a very strong signal to the market that we are very serious about disinvestment. We believe in private enterprise and we are willing to let private enterprise grow and the country grow. Somehow we've shied away from those very bold reforms. Now, this particular budget, the one we had right after the Modi 2.0 took over, we were told that Deepam is going to come out with a slew. We are waiting for those right now.
On the side note, talking of the government being an active player in some industries, a lot of state transports are in negative. The government has no business operating hotels on the state level or national level. So where do you see the balance in India? Because these all are very socialist in origins, that the government has a role in aviation, it has a role in hotels and buses and all that. So where do you see the transition from a socialist economy to capitalist economy coming? Because of course, free markets need to be encouraged if India is to be driven towards double-digit growth, which many still aspire for. So how do you see we transiting from a socialist economy to a capitalist?
Well, this is a bad time to be talking about promoting capitalism, right? Because globally we are seeing rise of China, if anything, has countered that. We are seeing all the pain points emerge out of the form of capitalism that exists. Not free markets, but the form of capitalism that exists in the US or even the OECD market. Look at the tensions, right? But remember, Tushar, in India, markets do fail all the time. Our private enterprise, we have corporate governance problems as well. When you hear terms like crony capitalism, there's a lot of validity to it. Our private enterprises have also not been paragons of virtue. But the reason we're still bad for private enterprise is because market mechanisms is quite brutal. If you're running a bad business, the markets do run you out of business. There is no concept of subsidizing and maintaining you in perpetuity as the sovereign does. Right? That is why we're running Air India.
Yes.
No one wants to take Air India.
Right.
And that's because the sovereign lives in perpetuity. So we can continue to maintain assets within the government, though it's a bad idea to do that. And that's why we argue that no, we should push disinvestment. But remember, when we say governments are needed, in the Indian case, we are not the US, we are not OECD markets, we are not China. So we shouldn't even compare because our institutions are different. We do know that the economics of healthcare, education are such that you will have market failures, right? So government, even in the long term, we are not saying bye-bye to government. Government in India will always remain a very large player in our economy. But I think it's very important that they focus and isolate themselves to sectors where the markets are breaking down. Such as health and education, particularly in the primary and the preventive part of health, and education mostly just the primary aspect
schools.
of it. But also remember aspects like research. Whenever there's a public good, and research is a public good, I mean private institutions, there are very few that are doing decent research.
Right.
So government is of course needed, and we need public money. We need governments to run a lot of things where markets will not function. But the government should get out of those sectors where the markets have proven their record in India.
One industry where the private sector is emerging well than the government is FinTech. Because now people need money. We need to put money in the hands of people for the economy to grow eventually as a short-term gain. So how do you see the FinTech sector in the 2020s? Because more people are coming online.
Right.
We are moving towards a very digitized economy. So how do you see FinTech and how do you see the new big four, the new merged banks being enablers of FinTech, because they can actually transform their own banking sector, the government that is, by playing big on FinTech, which the private players currently are. So how do you see that?
Technology has been a great enabler in the last 20 years, and it's likely to be exponentially more so in the future, particularly in the financial, the banking sector, etc. And now, of course, the entire payments platform is, technologically sort of supported. FinTech, I think in India, one has to be very bullish on, simply because, the last mile connectivity, the financial connectivity in India is still lacking, the brick and mortar.
Okay.
So access to banking, access to financial instruments is still very, very repressed. It's very limited. And I think this is where FinTech is able to leapfrog over the existing shortages of the brick and mortar or the infrastructure and give access to these kind of instruments to people at large. And frankly, that will be a source of tremendous growth moving forward. Okay, so FinTech is something we have to be particularly bullish on. Given the scale and complexity, it's great. I think it's more the regulatory aspect of it where we will have to
Right.
worry. And when I say worry, I mean we have to invest more energy into understanding, into getting the right regulation. A lot of our, FinTech startups, which are actually doing rather well, or even some of the established businesses are actually headquartered, they are outside of India. And those can become, I mean, there are concerns. And particularly when it comes to data, the regulating the data flows from FinTech, it's very important to realize that FinTech is not in isolation to the laws of the land. And so when it comes to data localization and what are the costs, what ensures privacy, whether it is okay or enough to maintain a mirror, or should we actually push for localization, and what will be the subsequent cost, etc. It's important to have nuanced discussions on this, because eventually it will cost you money. But it's important to realize that the only body that guarantees any of your legal rights as a citizen of the country, therefore to customers of FinTech, is the Supreme Court of India.
Right.
So maintaining data outside has its repercussions, particularly when it comes to legal recourse to any kind of disputes moving forward. Right. So this discussion is not a trivial one, and we need to have it at a much more nuanced level than we are having currently.
Right. Since you mentioned China, the way they've gone about the economy in the past few years, it's been sort of state-backed economy with the state-backed banks pushing out money. There's been no credit discipline as we're now witnessing, and the growth is even declining with each quarter. So how do you see China in one, with respect to the entire world economy, and two, in terms of the trade war?
Well, China has arrived, Tushar. And their growth might be declining, but it's still very high, right?
But just, do you agree with the way China has arrived, with the kind of credit growth it has seen?
In a world where winner takes it all,
right,
we can have moral discussions on it. It probably doesn't matter very much, at least from the point of view of India's future policy. We have to be pragmatic about the fact that we definitely are an economy, and as a nation we are pushing for rule-based relationship, rule-based institutions, right? Any kind of future growth of the world economy has to be rule-based. I think there is obviously a trust deficit when it comes to relationship with China, but I think economic relationship with China is something that we have to foster. It is the largest economy after the US. The kind of growth we are seeing there, it doesn't look like it will decline the way the European markets have declined or the economies have declined, the OECD markets, etc. It's likely to continue growing for the next several decades as well. Of course, at a lower pace, but it will continue to grow. The engines of growth there are likely to be AI and other tech-based and data-based. Those are all sectors where we need to work together. We need to collaborate. I think the Indian psyche is too beholden in our past relationship, right? Our past political relationship. Much more from a foreign policy perspective, but you have to realize that with growing trade, with growing economic relationship, it's easier then also to maneuver the foreign policy aspect of it, because you have two parties which are invested in each other. Right. The kind of distrust that the world economy has of China or has had in the past, it comes to bear in the form of the kind of investments, the large infrastructure investments the Chinese have done, the way they have flooded world economies, right? I mean, all of Latin America, Africa, where you go, automobiles, electronics, globally, they've flooded the markets. And because they have had excellent collaborations, joint ventures and partnerships of their own state-owned enterprises under the garb of, who knows, private enterprise or maybe explicitly state-owned, with a lot of European and American firms.
Right.
So there's been tremendous technology transfer. Something that we cannot even dream of right now for our side, right? So technology transfer does remain a huge bottleneck for our growth. And of course, that has happened in the Korean case, but in the Korean case, it has been much more in specific sector. In the Chinese, the kind of technology transfer that has happened, we're likely to see that country growing much further. But China remains a rather strident, belligerent, sort of an aggressive force. And so it's important for us to be pragmatic in our relationship with China. But we have our comparative advantages. And I think it's important to have a concerted, well thought through large economic policy vis-a-vis China. We cannot be, so the economy cannot be held hostage to the past, so the history of
the relations
between the two countries. And I think because both are dynamic countries, we have much to gain from trade.
Right. The last question, what is your budget wish list for the next year? The new budget comes in. So what do you see the changes or the improvements that can be made in the coming budget given the condition of the economy right now?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you, much unlike other people's opinion of this, I'm not a big fan of this annual pulling out of rabbits from a hat episode that we have, which is why actually I welcomed the series of announcement that the FM made, because it's a dynamic economy. Policies have to be, and not just minor, but sometimes even major policies, of course, the right way, but it has to happen in a dynamic and ongoing way, right? But the budget remains, there are traditions we are bound by. Budget remains an exercise where everyone, we are waiting for the government to make certain announcement. And why is it such a big deal in India? Because the government is a very large part of our economy. So we want to hear what are they going to do, and because it impacts everybody's life in some sense. I would like to see this government take a very serious stand on reforming agriculture.
Okay.
I think for us moving forward, I don't think we can afford to be ambivalent on what will be our future growth engine. We have a large population in agriculture that does need to be supported. But the government investments in agriculture has to be of the form that it encourages these people through, better skills, better education, better health, better connectivity. It encourages this movement of a mass away from agriculture into manufacturing and services, because those are the engines of future growth. Agriculture has limits to productivity.
All right. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
That was all from today's episode of Swarajya Conversations. Thank you so much.